Welcome to LinkedIn Live. My name is Tatiana Senjukovic, and I am an HR advisor and a leadership coach. And today's topic is feedback culture in the organizations. And I wanted to welcome a guest today who is a friend, a colleague, and a superb human being, Jared Dickinson, who is the CEO of JD Communication Strategies. And his organization supports leaders throughout the globe with the communication to create more impact and influence in their business and personal lives. And so I am really delighted, and I could see there is like delay in the video. So we're just gonna play with this, how it is. We were just talking about the technical pieces, but for everybody who's live with us, grab a cup of tea, get yourself comfortable. So we're going to explore for the next 20 to 30 minutes. We're going to explore a really important topic of feedback culture in the organizations. And Jared, welcome. And I am delighted to have you.
Nice to be here.
Anything you want to add to your intro, or did I do it justice?
I think you did it justice. I just want to say that I'm also very excited to be here and to continue the conversation. I feel like we had the difficult communications. This flows so well into the art of providing feedback and the power of that in our communication. So yeah, just happy to sip my cup of tea with you and have this conversation.
Perfect. That sounds great. So I'm going to start with the first question. And everybody, if you're listening and if you have any comments or any questions, put them in the chat. I will see them, and we will definitely flow with your comments and questions as they are important to you, and we will work with that in our conversation. But I'm going to start with my first question, so we can start this, is why do you think it is uncomfortable for so many of us to provide feedback and actually also receive it? So what are your thoughts?
Yeah. I mean, I think the best place to start with that is probably just sharing my own experience dealing with feedback. I mean, I think I came from a background of not really sharing challenging things and not being able to do so. Like that wasn't something that I learned or modeled for me. And so my inability to distinguish between a behavior and what wasn't working, and then also to speaking to one's character. And so I think I knew for me it was challenging to speak and provide feedback because it felt like, I literally might hurt someone, like emotionally hurt someone in providing this feedback that that could be really harmful and for future. I think for me it was like I'm a sensitive guy, and I also didn't want to come off as like, oh, it's about me. It's not a big deal. I'm overreacting to something, or I felt like I hadn't given them enough positive affirmations, and so to offer critical or constructive feedback would feel like it was too much. So those are a couple of things that come to mind from my own journey of like why it felt so uncomfortable for me, because I couldn't separate the behavior from talking about like the character of somebody.
I appreciate the part of the awareness of not being able to differentiate. And what comes up for me as well is that the modeling, like I didn't have, for example, in my experience, in my upbringing, I didn't have good modeling in terms of whether it's constructive feedback or it's, anything that might be perceived negative as well, right? It's like, how was it delivered by those around me in my environment was never modeled in the healthy way, I would say. It was definitely a lot of avoiding difficult conversations and just kind of more of a probably passive aggressive kind of approach. So I had to learn. And then I also realized I could have a manner. I come from a country that it's a lot more direct in just as a culture. So culturally, it's also for me is paying attention to that, as you were saying, and reading into how is this landing for the other person, and this nuances of maybe
Mm.
feedback back is that was not, that didn't land well, or that did. And so playing with that, I think for me, is also definitely something that would pop up.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I'd say the other thing that comes to mind from like an organizational standpoint is I think we work across the continuum from the artificial, there's like kind of artificial harmony in an organization to act like outright, it's like can be considered somewhat toxic. And I think for the former of like artificial harmony where these organizations are like a family, right? Which is a beautiful
Yeah.
thing. They're super friendly, they treat each other well, they're intelligent, they're creative, and they become friends and family, and it can be hard to give constructive feedback to your family or find that differentiation between I'm your friend and I'm your manager and we have something to get done and it's not going the way we want. And so I think that's also a common thing. People feel more uncomfortable because the relationships that have developed, even if they've been good, to find that difference between I need to do my job and I need to
Yeah.
also be a coach and provide feedback.
And how it's like, it's back to how you started as well. It's that I love the part, the artificial harmony, but it's also
Hmm.
to the point of me giving the feedback to the person doesn't have, it's not spliced together. It's
Mm.
not complete, how to untie that between, we got to get some work done, and this is constructive feedback for us to move forward, versus this is just me picking on the person and I really care for the person, that might hurt their feelings, and decoupling
Right.
that, as you bring
Totally.
it up. Yeah. What are the
Mm.
most common mistakes we make, that you find in your experience, when we provide feedback at work?
Um, I mean, if we're going to take the point of like, which I'm sure is very common that you find as well, is like people just don't give feedback, right? So like taking the assumption that they do offer feedback and it's also constructive because it's not challenging if you're not actually saying what needs to get better, right? You can just
Yes.
give affirmations for what is working and you don't venture into the aspect of like challenging communication and growth and giving that gift of like how do I get better, how do I grow. So I think some of the common mistakes people make is they're just not prepared, just thinking
Mhm.
through a little bit more intentionally the preparation of is this a pattern or is this just like a one time
Wow.
thing? Like, is it a bigger conversation? What's the best time and place for this? Or is this the right timing to do it? What am I asking for? Like explicitly asking to be different, or what am I needing, or how am I feeling about it? Just like, and it makes sense that these things they happen in the moment, so we don't always have time to prepare, but oftentimes we do have time to prepare and to think about. And the more that you prepare, the more that you practice it, obviously the more skillful you can be in the moment as well. So those are a couple things that come to mind of common mistakes.
Actually, the one that you bring up, I'll start from the end, is the one that not being prepared. And in
Mm,
any, like when it comes to anything difficult, if we don't prepare, we will default to how we deal with the discomfort, which we move through things quickly. We, speed things up. We might say something that we didn't fully mean. And so to me, it's like, it's definitely, I want to kind of highlight that piece of, when you have time and you realize that it's not just something small that can be addressed quickly, take your
mm,
time. And take
right.
your time. It's just like back to the difficult conversations
Mm,
piece, because it is, unless you're doing it's, any constructive feedback is
mm,
not easy, because it's not, as you said, it's not all affirmations. But
yeah.
I find it at work with leaders, particularly, as their all schedules are really full, is they
Mhm,
just kind of wedge some of these conversations and things like in between, or double book. And then
mhm,
they're internally, with awareness or not, sped up of like, well, I've got the other thing to go to. Like, I don't have time for this, but this needs to be done.
mm,
And it translates, like that energy translates to the other person, first of all, to be like, do you care to slow down?
I love it.
Did
As
they,
you Oh, there
did
you
they,
go. You
yeah,
literally said slow down, and I think the video listened to you and stopped you for a moment.
exactly. So perfect. So if you slow down and you make the space for the other person to receive the feedback and
Mm,
maybe give you a response that you're not in a hurry to just
mm,
close that conversation, it holds the conversation to me in a more graceful way. Because
mm,
when we're in a hurry and then we want to get it done, and the other person might rightfully so fall apart, and we have no space and or
mm,
capacity to hold it, that leads to like that's the opposite of how you want it. Just as you also said, pay attention to what you want. Why are you giving this feedback? What do you want from this? Right? Like, what
yeah,
is your intention? And I think sometimes
mm,
we're just like, oh, I've got to just do it. But really, what's your why behind it? That's important for the
mm.
person. Yeah.
So there's so many good things that you just said there, and I'm so glad that you brought up the aspect of time in allowing the space. I mean, the whole purpose of this, which leads into your second part around intention, is people also don't state that. Like,
Yeah.
whatever. This might be a performance review, and they get why we're going into feedback, but like literally stating though, like, what is it? What is your intention in this? Like, is it to make sure that I know that you're looking to get to the next level and become a director, and I want to make sure that that happens, and I support you in any way I can in which to do that. But like whatever it is, just literally like state it, like say it
Yep.
very specifically what the goal there is. And then the whole point of feedback is so we don't know what we don't know, and we want to get better and we want to grow. And so it's all about development. And if you don't give the time and space for the conversation to happen, it's not a one-way thing. And so your
No.
point about like creating the space to create the learning and the development, I think is so important, because it's not like you drop the bomb and then you run away like that. Honestly, that happens a lot.
Yep.
Like boom, and
Absolutely.
we're done. So it's like it's I think one of the other biggest mistakes is not using it, as you're saying, for an opportunity for coaching. So
Mhm.
framing negative or critical feedback as coaching recommendations. So we do a lot of coaching around certain things around communication, presentation skills for one. And so what that would look like is I wouldn't just say, Jeff, your closing statements were a little unclear. Like that's the feedback I'm giving you. At least I'm offering some kind of feedback, but can we actually put that as a coaching recommendation by saying, I noticed that I found myself a little confused by your closing remarks. I think if you would at the end would have summarized some of those key points of what you had covered, I think I would have left with a little bit more clarity on what that would look like for me moving forward. And so, if you're willing, next time you have a presentation, just to summarize those points, give it a try and see how it feels. But
Very.
that you're giving them that very
Yeah.
specific feedback on we all need that. We all need that mentor. We all need that coach on our side to give us that feedback.
I think you bring it up. Beautiful example, first of all. So thank you. It's in the sense of a lot of times, as you said, people just drop it and they're like, okay, this wasn't working, fix it.
Mm,
And if a person knew how to do it better, they would have done it, I think, better, right?
right.
So as you were speaking to the coaching piece, it's like you actually give a very explicit example to this person saying, well, look at these pieces, they might work for you. So it just gives a person actually some clarity and a direction when they might already feel lost because it's something
Mm,
new they're doing, or something that they don't know, what to do with this next. And so
yes.
that's like a nugget, to remember, to be like, it's not just saying what's not working. It's like,
Mhm.
what would you like? Something sometimes is like, what would you like instead, or what would you like maybe address a behavior or the way the person communicates. But in your example, like a very specific, like, here's how you might be able to finish this. And that's the feedback to me. I think another piece for me is also sometimes mistakes, and I was guilty of it because I remember thinking it is disregarding feedback because I don't like the person. So it's like, for example, where I think now it's kind of like, it's all feedback. It's all in the pool. And it's not exactly like I have to put it on and take it on fully, or it's something I did wrong, which I think early in my career, that was probably my critical mind. And just definitely looking at it from that angle. But as I did different roles and I grew in different roles, I realized that, and I also look at the lens of like, who is giving me feedback? And just like what you said, what's behind that feedback, possibly, if I can figure it out, right? But sometimes it could be the person that is not, that I don't like, but they said something that it's actually, like you mentioned, like it might be a pattern or it might be a thread. And I go, disregarding it completely based on the personal thing doesn't do anybody justice. So just having that awareness and paying attention to that for me. And Trey just put a question, so let me see what we've got. In what way can leaders make their direct report feeling safe to come for feedback? It's a great question, Trey. Thank you. Also, what's the fine line between feedback and constructive feedback? Oh my God. So let's start with the first one. In what way can leaders make their direct report feel safe to come for feedback? Jared, and you worked with a lot of leaders, and a lot of times it's that piece I think of could be the disconnect where they're like, well, I don't know what's happening because nobody's coming to me to tell me that that's happening. How did you navigate that with the person that's role?
Yeah, for some, it's gonna. The first thing that comes to me is leaders make their direct reports feel safe by modeling feedback, right? Like, so part of, I think, what the work that we're doing is we're normalizing feedback as on that note of this is data, right? Like, feedback is data. It's not necessarily. I learned this from a mentor of like, feedback is just data. It's not necessarily, doesn't have to be positive or negative. You're going to take your interpretation of it, but it's data to then use to formulate, okay, yes, I'm going to take this. And like you said, I'm going to wear it, or it's actually not very useful. I'm going to return it. Right. But at least you have that content in which to do that. So modeling it is absolutely there. And then also just like, it needs to be not just, I can't tell you how many people do feedback once a year. It's like a 1 year and review of performance.
Yeah.
And okay, I get it that some people will say, yeah, that's just like a big one, and then there's hopefully ones in between, but we tend to find that is not as frequent as what people think it is. And so I think I think you and I would agree, and we've talked about this, is like, we want to normalize, like, this is something that we do all the time. It's not like one big, huge thing where, once a year or once a quarter we do this. It's like an ongoing type of procedure, part of the process. Anytime that you're in a meeting with another person that is on your team, after that call, you take 2 minutes to say, what's one thing you did well and one thing that you could have done better? Like, can we standardize that in our cultures? That's just a given. So people don't have to, like, it's just normal. It's just part of how we do business.
And I think for me, thank you for bringing that up as well. I think, as you mentioned right now, that is a culture, meaning whether you do feedback once a year or you weave it in to like your check-ins that are once a week or after a meeting. That is the behavior where you're implicit and explicit in it. You might be wanting people to do something, but if you're not actually doing it, it's not going to be a part of your culture, because culture is all of those behaviors that we do repetitively. whether we're conscious or not. And I think for me, the safety as well, I love the part that's actually what I also meant when I said you might not like the person who's giving you feedback. Don't just it's data. It's literally, when you said it, I was like, that's exactly it. Treat it as data, first of all. And second of all, the safety, what I wanted to also highlight is, as a leader, what do you do with that feedback and how do you receive it? Because as you're saying, the modeling piece, right, and when providing feedback to those, it's also when people come to you and you say, I have an open door policy, or you say, like, I'm open to feedback, but when somebody says something, they might not do it in the most graceful way that you would like to receive feedback. But I have to tell you, as leaders, it's like, well, you're going to have to work with this from my point of view. But the part is, what I've watched in the organizations I worked and the leaders I worked with, is that when you say you want feedback, how do you respond and or react to it will absolutely feed into your people that report to you feeling safe or unsafe. And another piece of the unsafety that I've seen is when somebody who's reporting to somebody is bringing feedback forward, and then that feedback is used against them later. That is the most unsafe part for me. Oh, look at that. How can one turn that around? And whether you like hearing or not, watch your body language, watch your facial expressions, like data. Just remember, it's all data. You can process your emotions when you're the person that's reporting to you directly. You can process your emotions with a loved one, with your coach, with it, depending on the thing, but not with the person giving you feedback. Particular as a leader.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the other thing that,
Yeah, go
sorry.
ahead. No, go ahead.
I was just thinking of like the leaders. The other thing that definitely happens. So I was working with a CEO who like, the first question I asked was like, who do you get feedback from? And the question came back like, I don't have anybody. Like, I'm the one that gives everyone feedback, right? And so that was a huge red flag of like, okay, we all need this in order to get better. And so part of that process and working with this individual was to go to his executive team and direct reports and ask them that question, like, even if it's a couple questions, just on a regular basis, what's one thing that I can do you believe to be a better leader for you, and what's one specific action that would help to do that, and just repeat that every week and see what comes from that. You might be quite surprised.
I was going to say, it would be, I could guarantee it, it would be a very surprising, enlightening experience. Because as you said, I think the piece that I want to also highlight, as you said, is do this often. So you have a kind of, again, it's all data again, but you will have this like a whole point, from with the executive team or several members, where you could see, and some things just plant seeds. It's like it's just helpful to do that. And so I think that's good for the second question from Trang, is that what's the fine line between feedback and constructive feedback? I don't know.
How do you interpret that?
Um, I think maybe constructive feedback is, it has very what comes up at the moment for me, it's more like, I think feedback is just like a quick, what you're saying, actually it's like a quick thing, like, hey, we just finished the meeting, and what was something that worked, what was something that didn't. Actually, I think constructive feedback, and maybe that's actually kind of a faulty assumption, it's a bit more it has, like, what you gave an example to me. It's like, here's your presentation. At the end of your presentation, these are the things that were unclear. What I would have suggest, try something. So it has kind of like a bigger breadth to me. Or maybe it's something that is kind of more of a kind of like a deeper, maybe like a pattern. What you also spoke about, you're like, is this just like a one-off thing, or are you noticing that's a pattern? So to
Yeah.
me, I think, like, let's say we had a meeting, and after the meeting, if our culture is like, hey, what's the feedback? And I would say, hey, I noticed you weren't really participating in the meeting as much. I would have liked for you to actually, I really appreciate your opinion and your voice. And I would have
Mm,
liked to hear more from you. That to me is just literally feedback, because actually the person generally tends to participate in meetings and has has a way to actually deliver their opinion that it lands with people.
mhm,
So, to me, it's the constructive would be that the person is a leader, and they're always quiet in the meetings, but then they don't speak up, but then they go outside of the meeting, and then they start, I don't know, stirring things up. And so to me,
mm,
constructive feedback there would be like, hey, I'm noticing there's a pattern. There is a
mhm.
space for you to carry your voice, and you actually represent, like, whole, I don't know, part of the
Yeah.
organization. Yet that doesn't mean that you have to carrying that voice for those who report to you. So I think
Mhm.
that to me, like, and this is just, I've never
Yeah.
looked at it as a separate thing, but what about
Yeah.
you? What do you think?
I mean, no, I think I'm on board with what you're saying, and I think just the other thing that comes through with that is just the difference between small and big things, like to be explicit about that. So I think people will give feedback and not actually differentiate. Like this is like a 2 on the list of 10, and then this is like a
Mhm.
really important thing, like that differentiate because your feedback might all feel like an 8 to them, but they don't know whether it's small or big or if it's a big thing. So
Mm.
just being explicit about that.
I like that gradation actually, because you're hitting absolutely, because somebody who reports, which is true, it's like they might take any of your feedback as like, I've got to jump and do, and it's do or die kind of thing. Or
Yeah.
there might also be a personality that yeah, that takes a minute to reflect and be like, which part is mine, which part is not. So I think the
Mm,
gradation is actually like, I was like, oh, that's a great idea to tell them
mm,
this is
mm,
a 2, still feedback, but that's a 2. And
mm.
so that sounds great. I'm mindful of time. Let me see. We have another question. What are some practical tips to demonstrate an open, two-way feedback culture in the workplace? That was actually
Mm.
almost like one of the questions. Thank you, Train. I was like, perfect. Look at that. Jared, you want to jump in?
Um, let's see here. What are some practical tips to demonstrate open two-way feedback culture
Mhm.
in the workplace? So I thank you for saying two-way feedback culture because I think that's also an important differentiator of like, yeah, feedback is two-way. It's not just a one-way. Like I am the leader, I give feedback, like that example from
Yeah.
before. Um, so I think some ways that you can do open two-way feedback in culture is people have certain models. So when we go to an organization, some people are working with certain models that they want to continue to use and encourage and create a culture around you know, um, the whatever model. There's so many different models out there that people are using. Maybe it's the SBI or some keep it really simple and they have like a 1 by 1 or 2 by 2, like I was describing earlier, where it's like any important meeting after that, you give one thing they did well and one thing they can do better, and that is just institutionalized in the process and built a culture around that, and it's consistently touched upon and it's consistently encouraged. So those are two different scenarios that we often see to just like start to create that culture shift in feedback.
I think your example, thank you, Jared. I think you also that you gave that great example about the CEO of one way at one
Mm,
point. He was the only one doing the feedback or we
mm,
providing. And it's I was like, as I was reading this question too, I was like, well, here's your two-way. The first question
mm,
is it which way is it going? And is there two ways to start with? But it's
mm,
thank you for the sum of the models. I think when it comes to models, if you work in an organization, you don't have one, just use something simple. Don't
mhm,
make it really complicated. just like as you were saying, a 1 by 1 or 2 by 2, it's more of practicing it to me because it's uncomfortable. We don't tend to do things that are uncomfortable. Like, sure, I'm going to practice this every day. It's like, yeah, come on. It's like, taking cold plunges. I was like, I know it's good for me. Am I doing it? No, I'm not doing it. Like, no, I'm not doing it. So that's the part. Find something that's like uncomfortable enough, but you are willing to practice it. So it's not, again, it's the whole not all or nothing approach, because you will definitely, most likely resist it. But just you apply something, and like sometimes people go, well, in our culture we don't have anything, and I don't know. Take some ownership. I remember when being a director, we didn't have something as a culture in terms of feedback. Then I took my department and I, sat down with my team and I said, here how I would like this. What do you all think? How can we do more of a feedback culture within even our department? And then model it for everybody. And then it's actually like, that's how lots of things I piloted as an HR director. I would do it in my team. And then I will, first of all, there are probably ambassadors later to take it over because it's an HR department. But for me, I was like, this is a great pilot group. And then I can see how we can, kind of deliver it to the whole organization, but working with them on that. That's, I think, to me, it's like, you can find one more person. You literally don't have to be a boss. You can find a colleague and say, hey, can we do this together? Every time we're in a meeting or every time we're somewhere, can you do feedback? Like I did a presentation on Tuesday in the organization, and I knew a person in that organization. I just knew her actually from my life previously. And so I called her up afterwards and I said, I would like some feedback. And she asked me really great questions. And I really respect her as a professional as well. And she pointed out to things that I would have never thought about, like not thought about at all. And so that's the part. It's like initiated. It's also like take that space as well. I'm aware of time, so I just want to be mindful to see if there's like a question that's gonna like get us down on some path. If there anybody else has any questions, pop them in now, because we're probably gonna wrap up in the next 5 minutes or so. But I guess on the positive side, what are some ways that we can recognize or acknowledge when employees or us, even ourselves, excel when it comes to communication and feedback?
Yeah, I mean, there's always opportunity for making sure. I think sometimes it's the hardest thing to do is to offer, positive reinforcement and being merely explicit in what that looks like, not just like speaking in generalization. So I think there's always an opportunity. And sometimes people roll their eyes when I say this, but like, I think when you're giving constructive feedback is also in communication, we call that counterbalance. Some people call it the sandwich, which I don't believe is true, where you say something nice before you say what needs to change. But I think if you say something nice in a way that's authentic and truthful and explicit about what it is that you appreciate about them, that's a skillful form of counterbalancing before then you say what's not working. So I think that is a great place in which to offer an appreciation if you are able to. I know that can be challenging. That's one place.
Yeah, I think for me as well, that's a great place. It's also when you're doing constructive feedback, it's uncomfortable. It could be uncomfortable for both parties. But when things shift, for example, or like that feedback is taken into consideration and things are actually heard and implemented, for me, that's the part is also to recognize, is whether to recognize the CEO I worked for, and when I said something and later he showed up differently, for example, in the meeting, it's positive reinforcement to me. So it's like maybe because I'm applying, kind of child, like, the whole parenting piece. But overall, we think we're all grown up, but our behaviors are a lot of times revert to whatever the default was when we were children. But to me, it's like that positive reinforcement, just like what you're saying, even not in the feedback. But if I've given feedback to somebody and they've taken consideration and adjusted, to the best of their ability. To me, it's really important to note that, because then the person actually knows I am noticing it. So I'm actually paying attention in a sense of I care. And second is it's working. How do we also know what something that we changed is working?
Right.
It's just like we asking for feedback, but waiting for that. It's another space of feedback, but it's this part of like recognizing that the person is trying and you've seen it. And so we always come back to this whole sense of all of us humans who want to just be seen, actually, and heard, and understood. So that comes back to that safety, that sense of safety that Trang was asking the question earlier, is that how to create that and nurture it. That's one of the ways, is you pay attention and you care, even when you do difficult conversation with that person. Dasha wrote something actually. Yeah, I think of feedback framed in a kind of way is an act of generosity. Yeah, it's definitely, exactly. Sometimes we just can work on the delivery piece. The delivery piece might be finessed, but it's taking your time and resources like your emotional, your mental, and delivering something for the person, because otherwise you could just move on and not do that.
And I think what you said, Tatiana, you said something about, just in a more positive note, of recognizing, acknowledging. I loved what you said about asking people. I don't know if you can say something maybe a little bit more about that, because I think that was so true.
Oh, when we talked about it. So recognizing, acknowledging, I think it was more in a general sense, like how do people know how to recognize them or acknowledge them, is ask them. So you have a team, or you have people that you want to create a safe work environment. You want to create actually a thriving work culture. Ask them what it looks like for them when they feel recognized and acknowledged. And I was giving, Jared and I, before we jumped on live, I was giving an example in my team. Again, I literally, that was my pilot. I was like, hey team, what does, for each of you, what does recognition, just like, when do you feel recognized and acknowledged? And we came together as a team that for some of them, like the flexibility of the work schedule was really important. That was before kind of, and within COVID time. But really what was the middle ground where we all met as a team and we were working together physically, we could do that, was actually to go out together to lunch. That was like in a beautiful place, because half of them were total foodies. So it was super important to them that we're going to go to some cool place. And it just lit them up. Like that was like a big adventure. We would go out once a month to, some fabulous lunch, place, where I was saying, I remember thinking for myself, I, as the leader, for me to be recognized, which I talked to my boss, was I needed to go and take a course that I traveled for. So for me, it was like needing the travel and adventure and seeing other cultures, but also learning something new that was professionally connected. And if I did that like once every 6 months, I was good. I felt recognized and seen and motivated. And that definitely, so again, but I only realized that about myself is when I did that piece with my team and realized they all had their own different ways how they want to be recognized. But if you have a big organization, you still can ask, you still can narrow things down. It still comes back to a lot of times to connection and relationships. So how do you co-create that space? That's the part.
And just the one thing I'll add to that is, I love that everyone is different, right? The thinkers, they want to be appreciated once things are done. The feelers in your organization, they want to be appreciated as it goes along the whole way. Like, so it's just like you're talking about, it's like, ask them, what do they need? What's their communication style? What would be most helpful for them? So I think that's such a key piece there.
Oh, this is there's something new I learned right now, is that the thinkers and the feelers, which is actually so true, is that the feelers are like, how does it feel all the way through as we're doing it?
Yeah. They want that validation throughout. They're like, yeah, okay.
The feelers here, you know what I mean? And the thinkers are like, don't talk to me until it's done. And it's not done yet. Trust me.
Yeah, you're describing like the book Five Love Languages. Yep, for the
Yeah,
workplace. Totally.
exactly.
Yeah,
It's learning
absolutely.
where can you speak to the other person's hearing, where can you say something that they're actually, and vice versa. So as we
Mm.
wrap it up, I think the last thing I want to ask is, what's one thing that you want the listeners, to walk away with or pay more attention to based on the topic of feedback?
Just, I mean, I'll keep it simple of just like thinking about feedback. Just jot down a couple thoughts about it. Take 5 minutes just to think about like how is feedback happening in your world as it relates to work in your personal life. I mean, this stuff is so real within how you're raising families and partnership and friendship and familial associations. I mean, it's just like think about that and like, is there something one thing that you want to do to do differently that can kind of provide some more support in your day to day. So just take the time, take 5 minutes, do it right after this, before the
Yeah.
top of the hour. Take 5 minutes to do some reflections on that.
That sounds terrific. I would add mine would be actually remembering it's just and all is data. And what do
Mhm.
you do with data? You just take a poll and you then make decisions. So not the whole the personal, the taking things personally, you can hopefully disembark it, just separate it a bit. So just remembering data is helpful to understand our own patterns. And
Mm,
unless we're receiving that data, we don't notice it. So
mm.
yeah, so hopefully that kind of decouples the personal thing from it
I'll,
and just
I'll put into that to your saying the James Baldwin quote of the author activist who's like, not all things that are faced can be changed, but
yeah,
nothing can be changed until it's faced. So
it's
we
exactly
have
that.
to be the ones to step up and offer that gift because it really truly is a gift, the act of generosity, as Dasha said, of providing that feedback.
It's exactly that. So unless you become aware of it, as we wrap this up, you won't know what needs your attention
Mm,
and needs some
mm.
changing. So
Yeah.
thank you so much. One thing is, how do people, before we definitely, as I forget sometimes, how do those listening can find you and your work?
You can find me right on LinkedIn. I think you can probably click over and find some more about us right there on LinkedIn. You can go to jdcommunicationsstrategies.com and yeah, and schedule a talk to talk to us.
That sounds great. It's been super fun. Thank you, everybody, for being very engaging.
Mm.
And we'll be back soon. And yes,
Thank you. Thanks,
have a
Tatiana.
beautiful afternoon.